So this is the second monthly briefing of the COVID-19 impacts on jobs in the Illawarra region. And today, so for those of you that I don't know that may be on the call, my name is Deborah Murphy and I'm the CEO of Regional Development Australia, or RDA, here in the Illawarra. I'd like to first acknowledge country and pay my respects to the Dharawal people and elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to have an acknowledgement for mental health, given the COVID situation that we're in, that I stole from Australian First Responders, which is that we acknowledge and show my respects to the people in the group who have lived experience and know your voice is valued and important to our community and the world we live in. I also acknowledge, Sharon has already said hello, the MPs, which is the Honourable Sharon Bird, the member for Cunningham, and I believe that Paul Scully, the member for Wollongong, will be joining us as well. In terms of RDA Illawarra, I have an apology from the Chair, Eddie De Gabriel, who is on a teleconference at the moment with the Minister for Regional Development, the Federal Minister Nola Marino. But we have in attendance two board members, Mark Roberts and Paul Wellings, who have also said hello. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to deliver a presentation which will be recorded and we publish it on our website. So I'd ask that you all, if you haven't already been muted, is that you mute your microphones and hold questions to the end of the presentation. We won't be taking anything out of the chat box, so please don't use the chat box. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter, Alex Spillett, who is the RDA Illawarra Policy Manager. So over to you, Alex.
All right, thanks, Deborah, and I'm hoping you can hear me. As Deborah said, this is the second of our webinars on the impact of COVID on the local and broader economy. As we move through this set of slides, just bear in mind that the reference point for a lot of the data is March 2020. So we've deliberately used that as a reference point so that we can make sure that we're sort of comparing apples to apples as we go along. The data that we use is published by the ABS on a monthly basis. It's actually a month in arrears. It used to be a fortnight, but they've moved now to a monthly in arrears publishing cycle. So bearing that in mind, we'll move on. At least I hope we'll move on. Let's have a look firstly at the impact of COVID and lockdowns on the Illawarra employment scene. Compared to March 2020, we now have just over 10,000 fewer people on the payroll, and our estimated unemployment is just above 12%. As you can see from the chart, which shows in the green the pre-COVID employment levels, and the red and the black are the movements since. The major areas that have been impacted are accommodation and food, arts and recreation, education and training, transport, postal and warehousing, construction and manufacturing, along with the retail trade. You can see that the impact on accommodation and food has been particularly acute, given that the workforce was just over 12,000 before COVID began. It's now shed just over 5,000 of those jobs in the 18 months since. In terms of gains, there have obviously been gains in public administration and healthcare, with some also gains in the financial sector and amongst professionals. Looking at the overall employment trend for the Illawarra, you can see the first big spike that we had in the initial lockdown, and then the very large dip that we've had in the last 12 weeks since the lockdown began in June. A positive note is that decline has now plateaued over the last few weeks, and we've certainly seen a stabilisation of the job losses after that initial fall. Again, you can see here the same trends replicated at a more local level, looking here at the SA4 regions throughout the Illawarra, Dapto, Port Kembla, Kiama, Shellharbour and Wollongong. Probably the thing to note out of that is that Shell Harbour, Kiama, who have been trending higher than the other regions throughout, are now dipping towards the rest of the region as well. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble changing these slides. Okay. To have a look a little more at the employment impact by sector, again, this is just a strip out from the first slide that we saw of the actual job changes over the last 18 months, and really just emphasises the impact on accommodation and food and the other areas that we've already discussed. I guess the concern that I continue to have is the accommodation and food sector. Those people having moved out of that sector into other areas where they can use their skills. As we now open up, is it going to be an issue for those people to re-attract staff that they previously had, and what impact that's going to have on our overall ability to open up effectively? The ABS has now started publishing a little bit of information about the subgroups, so we can start breaking down some of those larger occupation sectors into their subgroups based on the ANZIC codes. This is unfortunately only available Australia-wide, but it does give a very stark picture of specifically, you look at the impact on accommodation and food and beverage as being the sort of major areas of hospitality, and you can see that the losses in those industries are quite acute. On the flip side, you can see that social assistance, public administration, and hospitals have added jobs over the last 12 to 18 months as well. The bubble chart that we have here depicts the performance of those particular segments over the last 18 months. The picture that we're looking at now is that just before the current lockdown, and just to give you an impression of how the chart works, businesses that are above the horizontal line are growing. Those that are below the horizontal line are contracting. Those on the right-hand side of the vertical line are above pre-COVID levels of employment, and those to the left are below. So you want to be in the top right-hand quadrant, and you really don't want to be in the bottom left-hand quadrant. So the recovery at that stage in early June was looking pretty good. Even accommodation and food services was adding people at a fast rate and moving towards pre-COVID levels of employment. Since then, however, we see a different picture. Whoop, one too far. We see a picture now of a lot of those industries tumbling back into that bottom left-hand quadrant. And the impact on accommodation and food has been, as you can see, quite acute. It was in the top of the top left-hand quadrant. Now it's in the bottom of the bottom left-hand quadrant. So not only well below pre-COVID levels of employment, but continuing to decline. So not a pretty picture, but not entirely unexpected. Moving on to the impact by age, and again, this is at a national level. Data at a more local level is not available on a frequent basis, but it shows the impact by age cohort, moving from 15 to 19 through to 70 and over, and for female and male workers. The datum point for this in March 2020 was 100%. So it's everything's measured from the 100 level. So if you're below the 100, then jobs have been shared. If you're above, then jobs have been added. As you can see, the cohort that has had the major impact is between 15 and 30-year-olds. Those with an established career have certainly managed to maintain employment, and those who are slightly more experienced have actually added to the workforce, which is a trend that has been there for the last 9 or 10 months. So we move on to the jobs impact by gender. You can see that this shows the difference between payroll jobs, males and females on a state basis. And from this analysis, the lockdown-related job losses for women have been greater than for men overall. We saw a trend from about October last year of women re-entering jobs at a much faster rate than men. Since the latest lockdown, that trend has reversed, and we see women now leaving the workforce, at least temporarily, as a result of the latest lockdown. And presumably a lot of that is to do with someone having to be at home to homeschool kids. Interestingly, the overall impact on payroll dollars for New South Wales hasn't been as big for this lockdown as it was for the previous one, and also it comes from a higher base. So you can see there that pre-current lockdown, we had a lot more people, over 5,000 more people in the local workforce than we did at the start of March last year. And as a result, the impact hasn't been quite as great as it was. But there's certainly been a decline in overall payroll for males. Moving on to talking about business size and the impact by business size. It's true to say that the Illawarra closely mirrors New South Wales in terms of the percentages of small micro businesses and sole traders, and you can see that by this comparison here that's taken from the ABS data. It's also true to say that the Illawarra has a higher proportion of small businesses in regions or sectors that are more impacted by the COVID lockdowns, such as accommodation and food, arts and recreation, construction, manufacturing and retail. So probably no surprise that if we look at the New South Wales trend for impact by business size, that trend will be replicated in the Illawarra. And as you can see, sole traders, small and micro businesses continue to be those most affected by losses of payroll jobs, coming from a high of nearly 110 as an index pre-lockdown down to 88.2. As you can see from medium and larger size businesses, that trend has started to either plateau or reverse. So they're starting to take people back onto their payroll, but that has not been replicated with small businesses and sole traders as yet. And finally, moving on to our impact on commuting habits. If the idea of lockdown was to stop people moving around, it certainly had the desired effect. In terms of rail commuting, we now have 88% reduction in journeys since pre-COVID, and that trend didn't really. The initial drop down that we had did recover, but only to about 50% of our previous commuting level, and now that's dropped considerably down to 88%. Presumably that will start to increase as we move forward through opening up again. Similarly, the impact on road commuting has been quite significant this time. A 37% reduction in journeys on major routes from the Illawarra to Sydney. We saw that during the first lockdown, and it recovered to nearly 100% afterwards. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on this event. So the major takeaways from that are that our job losses seem to have been stabilised over the last few weeks. We're seeing some uptake again in larger and medium-sized businesses of payroll jobs, although there is still a significant impact on smaller companies, sole traders, and specifically in the accommodation and hospitality areas. So there are some causes for some cautious hope as we open up, but there are still going to be areas that I think are going to be considerably impacted, and that certainly includes the accommodation and hospitality sector, mainly by their ability to actually attract employees. So that brings us to the end. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.